Hello, everyone. This is Larry Kotlikoff. I'm back with another episode of Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have Jason Furman. I don't know if we're good friends or we're friends, at least. We're not close friends. We generally agree, except when we disagree, but we're pretty close most times. Let me tell you about Jason. Jason is an economic hotshot, I would say. He's a big deal in economics. He's the Aetna, that's the Aetna insurance company, I take it, professor of the practice of economic policy, jointly at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Department of Economics at Harvard University. And Jason engages in public policy through research, writing, and teaching in a wide range of areas, including U.S. and international macroeconomics, fiscal policy, labor markets, and competition policy. In the past, Jason served 8 years as a top economic advisor to President Obama, including serving as the 28th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from August 2013 to January 2017, acting as both President Obama's chief economist and as a member of the cabinet. So he was right there in the Obama administration, involved in calling with other people, calling the shots, including on Obamacare, how that was designed. He had a big hand in that, I understand. In addition, now we have some people arguing it should be yet again dismantled. In addition to articles in scholarly journals and periodicals, Jason is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and Project Syndicate, and the editor of 2 books on economic policy. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Jason, welcome. It's great to have you.
Great to be here, and I'd be honored to be called a good friend by you, Larry. I've been learning from you for my entire career.
You have become a good friend, a very good friend now. After doing this with me, you're now a very good friend.
Okay. Wow.
Okay,
Well, why don't we wait till the end to decide that?
Let's see. Okay, good. So, Jason, start us out like everybody does with your story, which is you were born where and how did you evolve from a little baby to being at the cabinet, in the cabinet room, at the table with President Obama and involved with President Clinton earlier on, I guess, and his administration may be more at a junior level, but really talking to probably every president thereafter at some level, maybe not Trump, but certainly I would think Biden, and being so influential in the policy world with organizations like Brookings and the Hamilton Institute. You've got so many titles. If people go to your wiki page, it's a long read. It's a very impressive read. Start where were you born?
Okay. I was born in New York City, in Greenwich Village. My father was actually, when I was very young, doing a PhD in economics at Columbia. He never finished it. He ended up ABD and going into business. But I certainly started hearing about economics a lot from a young age. I loved math and physics. But I also volunteered on the Mondale presidential campaign when I was in high school in 1984. And so for me, I liked precision and math and logic, but I also liked the complicated, messy things going on in the world around me. And so in college, I gravitated towards economics, as my father had done, and it was a way to think in a logical, disciplined, and mathematical way about some of the issues I think are.
Quick question: where did you go to college?
I went to Harvard too. I've been on and off here for a while now.
Okay, got it. Okay.
And so I thought I wanted to just be a pure academic, and so I went straight from college to grad school, and then ended up getting a call from Joe Stiglitz's office when he was chair of the CEA, and he had heard about me from my advisor. Did a job interview. The interview lasted half an hour. Joe said 29 minutes worth of stuff. And I said, thank you. And he said, you're hired. And I thought that I'd go to the Council of Economic Advisors, that it would just help me come up with new research ideas. This is what Greg Mankiw had done, what Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, all these people had done it. They'd done it for maybe a year. They came back. They became real academics. Unlike them, after my first year, I loved it so much. I stayed a second year, then a third year, then a fourth year. And by that point, I was on a different track, a really policy-oriented track. Now, I came back, finished my PhD. I remember Greg Mankiw said the first good thing George Bush did for education in this country was win the election and force me back to finish. I finished up, but by then I wasn't going to be headed to the academic job market. So I ended up in think tank world, policy world, and I had done the Gore campaign. I had done economic policy for the Kerry campaign. I swore I would never do another campaign again. But in 2008, President Obama or his team said, would you come meet with him in Chicago? Would you talk to him? I said, sure, I'll come meet with you. I'll come talk to you. When he said he wanted me to work with him, I wasn't really in a position to say no. And so that was an amazing experience, that campaign, because it felt more like governing than campaigning, because it was the financial crisis, staying on top of it. He wanted to have conversations about, should we be buying toxic assets or should we be injecting capital and stuff like that? Not, how do we attack John McCain? He won. I did the transition, White House, where I was deputy NEC director for 4.5 years.
Just to be clear, everybody knows NEC is the National Economic Council. It was set up by President Clinton. It's there's the Council of Economic Advisors, and then there's like a higher level council, which is the National Economic Council, which I guess both speak directly to the president, but maybe you can explain the difference.
There's nothing I'm more of a world expert on than the difference between these two, because I think I'm the only one that's worked at both of them twice. Yeah. The National Economic Council is like the National Security Council, except for the economy, of course. It coordinates the economic policy making. And so it chairs the meetings, it sets the agenda, it's responsible for the memos that go to the president. There's a meeting with the president, it sets up the meeting. And in doing that, the NEC really has to integrate policy, but also politics, communications, working with the different interest groups, working with the governors and mayors, working with the Capitol Hill, et cetera. CEA is more like an internal think tank in the White House. What's really cool is we're the only country where the head of the internal think tank reports directly to the president, and where they're part of the swim of everything in the White House. But they are definitely coordinated by the NEC. And in fact, even the Treasury Secretary is coordinated by the NEC. The Treasury Secretary does not send memos directly to the president. They go through the NEC and through the NEC process, just like every member of the cabinet does.
Well, okay. So continue. So you became
So I was deputy there, and did a lot of issues, but fiscal was my bread and butter. The Affordable Care Act, the negotiations as the tax cuts were expiring, the fiscal cliff, the debt limit. These were the things I lived and breathed. And then in the last 3.5 years, I moved over to chair the Council of Economic Advisors. And for me, it was exciting because that was basically getting back to more economics. Instead of being, in the swim of every negotiation and every political thing, had this just amazing team and would sit back and sort of ask questions I thought were important, or try to say, here's the issue that's coming down the pike on the agenda. What can we do to get ahead of it? What type of model could we build that would help inform people's answers to this? And so I think I'm one of the economists. Often economists go to government and they come out more political. I think I came out less political. Then I went in and was happy to return to Harvard as a professor of practice, where I try to share a bit of that wisdom, accumulated wisdom, with my students.
Cool. So let me ask you the big question I'm sure is on everybody's mind, which is, how do you see the political landscape right now? Are we heading to another Trump presidency where he wants to be a dictator for at least a day, which I'm not sure what that means, line up all the Democrats and shoot them, or what exactly, but and then say it wasn't my fault. How do you see things? How do you read the political landscape?
Yeah, so if you're asking me my probabilities for who wins the next presidential election, I have a really simple answer, which is that the last 6 or 7 elections have been incredibly close. Many of them have depended on things like who a third party candidate was, some event that happened in October, some other contingency. And so you start at your prediction of 50-50. You're then allowed to say, hey, this candidate's much better than that candidate, or the economy's great, or the economy's terrible. And you're allowed to change the probabilities to as high as 60 or as low as 40, but you can never get outside that range in what is really a closely divided country. So, if it's Biden Trump, and that's the most likely, I think it's roughly 50-50. Maybe President Biden has a bit of an edge in his reelection efforts, but it's a very divided country. And, I would rather have a much better Republican Party, one that's closer to, a set of conservative economic ideas. Those aren't my ideas, but I'd rather have that. And more important than any economic idea is, a set of respect for rule of law. So if we're up to me, I would rather pick a Republican candidate who might have a better chance of beating President Biden. I would vote for President Biden. But if in the bad case, from my perspective, wouldn't be nearly as bad as if President Trump won election.
Do you see anybody beating Trump for the nomination?
I mean, he has 60%, and there's all sorts of, it's divided among the others. The one thing I'd say is it is just amazing how much winning Iowa and or winning New Hampshire changes things. So if Nikki Haley wins either one of those, she will be catapulted to a level of free media as well as fundraising, so paid media, the likes of which we can't quite picture now. So those two, are a possibility for all of this. But, I think the betting markets have her at roughly 1 in 6, and I don't think I'd be much more optimistic for her than that. And I don't really see much of a path for anyone else.
I see. Do you see a third party candidate emerging out of all this?
Well, are you running again, Larry?
Well, no, not this year. Although people have asked me to. Even people that said you were crazy the first time. If they said, "I wish you had," they've actually even said, "I wish you would become president." I'm not sure my mother told me that, but everybody else at the time. I had a funny story about her. She's now passed, but she died in 98. But she, let's see, I was running, and this was in the 2016 election as a write-in candidate, basically to put forth an economics-based policy platform. And I wrote a book called You're Hired, which people can freely download from kotlikov.net. And my mom calls me and says, after pushing her for about 4 months to vote for me, she said, "I've decided to vote for you." And then she calls me up and says, "But what if you take votes away from Hillary?" And I said, she hangs up, and then 4 minutes later she calls me back. "Well, what if you take votes away from Hillary?" I said, "Well, that's the idea." And but anyway, I'm not sure. She voted for Hillary, I think, and that was that. But what about Kennedy? Could he is he viable in the sense of, to start a third party is a big deal. You need a lot of signatures. So, same thing as Cheney.
I mean, there's him, there's Jill Stein, there's Cornel West, and then there's this big open question of no labels. And with every one of these, the question is, how many states do they get on the ballot in, and who do they take votes from? And, you have things where if you reassign the votes from Pat Buchanan, or whoever it was, not Pat Buchanan, from Ralph Nader to Al Gore in 2000, Al Gore would have won. In 2016, I think if you took the Jill Stein votes and gave them to Hillary Clinton, she would have won. My guess is you could tell stories that go the other way in 2020 or other years. So you just need to be in a few states and need a few people. And it's another thing that just adds randomness to all of this.
So you think their strategy is just to go for a couple of states? Because in California, I think you have to get 500,000 signatures, which is you need about $70 million to get onto the ballot, even if you have time, across the country. If you're not on the ballot, you're nowhere, as I learned, because people aren't going to write anybody in. So then the question is whether they have any time to really be viable. And if they're not really viable nationwide, would anybody bother voting for them? Might just be viewed as a throwaway vote.
You're more expert on this than I am. But, the other thing is, a lot of these states come down to maybe hundreds of people different between the two major candidates, maybe thousands. So any small thing can change it. And by the way, the people who voted for Obama twice and voted for Trump once, and those are the types of people that would make or break this election. I don't have a great insight into them. That's not sort of a natural way of thinking to me. And so what leads them to bounce around or vote for someone else, I just don't know. And that's why I think of this a little bit more like a coin toss than like something that one can reason one way through the answer to.
So let's talk a little more about the economy and why.
Another coin toss.
Yeah, another coin toss, which is, I think people are hurting in a way that hasn't been publicly acknowledged, maybe by the president and his economic advisors. Real wages are down 7%. Median weekly earnings in the U.S., according to the BLS, I just looked at the numbers that are reported by the Federal Reserve on their website. They're down 7.12% from first quarter 2020. And by rights of the economy not experienced COVID, we'd probably be having people having real wages who were more like, 12% above where they are now, given natural, maybe 1% real wage growth. So one concern I have is why haven't things rebounded? Is this just kind of wage stickiness? And now in your view, do you think we're going to see a period, or should we be seeing a period where nominal wages grow faster than prices, so the real wages catch up? But if the Federal Reserve keeps focusing on nominal wage growth and says that's a bad thing if it's too high, if it's bigger than our 2% inflation target, and then kind of starts raising interest rates, that's going to keep us down in the tubes for quite a while in terms of real wages catching up, in terms of the economy getting back on track. Do you see that as something that the Federal Reserve understands, that there's a dynamic to nominal wages lagging and then accelerating due to sticky wages?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things in there. Let me start almost from the beginning, which is there was this theory that if you heat the economy and make it really hot, you're going to raise wages or raise wage growth. That theory was true. The problem is that theory was about nominal wage growth, which did go up, but also price growth went up. And over the last couple of years, as you noted, price growth went up more than wage growth went up. And so workers fell further behind. That's been a bad thing for people. But I very much agree with you. That also gives some room going forward for prices to come down before wages come down. So taking stock of where we are right now, there's a lot of different ways to measure inflation. But some of, if I had to just pick one, 6-month core PCE inflation, that's what the Fed targets effectively. It excludes food and energy. That's a 2.5% annual rate. You then look at a bunch of different wage measures, and I'll take my favorite here, the employment cost index, excluding incentive paid occupations, and that's growing at about a 4.5% rate. Now, because of productivity, wages can grow faster than prices, but normally, if you see that type of wage growth, you'd expect about 3.5% inflation. So wages right now are saying inflation is 3.5. Prices are saying inflation is 2.5. And so to me, it is a little bit of an open question. I think the most likely scenario is the one that I think was implicit in your question, Larry, which is that there is room for workers to regain some of the losses they had, that labor markets have loosened quite a lot. And my favorite measure is to look at the difference between job openings and unemployed, which had been 2 and now is like 1.35. And so I think wage growth over the next year or two will come down and come down to something that's consistent with the 2.5% price growth. I think the leads and lags in wages and prices, I don't think the evidence on that is so crystal clear that I'm 100% sure about what I'm saying. So the other possibility is that we've just gotten lucky in the last 6 months in price growth. And because business costs are still going up in terms of wages, that you get the sort of wage price cycle dynamic or wage price persistence. And so wage growth doesn't come down, but instead price growth goes up. I think that's the less likely of the two. In terms of how the Fed understands this, I think they understand everything that I just said and that you said in your question here. That's why they're not raising interest rates at their next meeting next week. That's why they're probably not going to raise interest rates again. And so I think they will give some room for wages to catch up. I do think the Fed, though, in the 2021 was operating on sort of hope for the best, plan for the best. And so they were assuming everything would work out in their policy. Now I think they are hoping for the best and planning for the worst. And so they are really, really averse to a continued inflation scenario. So if there's a chance of inflation coming back up, they're going to still keep rates high and not cut them. But so I think they're on. So I don't think it's that they have the wrong model of the economy, but I think their risk management at this point is tilted towards, if we have to make any mistake at all, let's make a mistake in bringing down inflation faster rather than avoiding a recession.
So, it seems to me that they're bringing down inflation is like bringing down the economy. That's their method. Let me ask you whether, if you're the head of the Fed, you would do what I say publicly that Jerome Powell should be doing, which is to talk to the 35 million people that are actually setting prices. There are 35 million businesses, and saying, look, here's our game plan. We have to all be on the same page. We're going to real wages are down 7% from, they're down 12% from where they should be. And so for a while, you need to try and restore real wages of your workers, not take all the profits for yourself, and to set prices in a manner consistent with 2.5% inflation, maybe going down from 3 down to 2 over the next few years, but give your workers a salary increase, because that's where the real economy, in other words, do this kind of 1960 John Kennedy jawboning, and not just rely on setting one interest rate every so many months to do all your work for you. I just think that that's, a little heroic, frankly. And it's not clear that, clearly inflation took off without the Fed's lowering rates to make it happen. Okay. So it's hard to believe that raising rates would make it come down necessarily. The Fed, I think, so part of my question is whether you think that he should be doing some jawboning. And part of my question is, where do you think the inflation starting, in the last couple of years, it's now been maybe a 20% increase in the price level cumulatively since inflation started taking off, where that came from, and how much of this was due to the Fed, how much was due to overstimulus of the economy by Trump, by Biden? What's your view? How much of this was bottlenecks, supply side constraints? Took a while for wheat to be produced in other places than Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is not the largest producer of wheat. We got that impression, but it's the 8th largest. China and the U.S. are the first and second. And so obviously farmers can produce more wheat or plant more wheat than something else, and bingo, the price can come down in a few months. How do you see, answer those two if you could.
Yeah, so that's a lot of different questions. Why don't we go back to the beginning and then we'll come up to the present. I think inflation was more demand than supply, but they both played a role. The biggest supply part that played a role was just, the difference between core inflation and overall inflation. Overall inflation rose much more than core inflation did. And so, in 2022, Oil prices went up a lot. That had nothing to do with the Fed, nothing to do with Biden, everything to do with Putin. But if you look at core inflation, I think most of that really was about demand. We gave people a huge amount of money in 2020 and 2021. At the same time, there was stimulus that would have come anyway because people had cut back their spending during the pandemic. So they saved extra money as a result of that and would have been in a position to spend things when things reopened. I think the fiscal side was much bigger than the monetary. The monetary, in some sense, was a less forgivable error, though. Fiscal policymakers were operating with a lot of uncertainty. Fiscal policy is always really political. The Fed has lots of PhDs. It was making its decisions later, and I think continuing to make mistakes through towards the end of 2021. There certainly were some of the supply issues, but a lot of the supply issues people cited were really demand, not supply. So let me give you an example. The ports. We all saw pictures of ships backed up at our ports, and it looked like something was wrong with our ports. Well, nothing was really wrong with our ports. Our ports were processing 20% more stuff than they were before COVID. It's just that Americans, and I'm making this number up, wanted to buy 30% more stuff than they were buying before COVID. And so, as I teach in my intro class, the demand curve shifted. The supply curve did not shift, but you moved up a relatively inelastic supply curve. And so a lot of the supply was really demand masquerading as supply. Now, to give the Fed credit, they were behind the curve. They caught up much faster than anyone would have expected. They raised rates by 75 basis points a meeting. I think this did matter more than you think, Larry, and I think it mattered through two channels. One channel is that it affected demand in the economy, especially relative to the counterfactual in which they did nothing. So you saw residential investment, for example, decline in 2022 at the fastest rate it had since the financial crisis. And that's one of the main levers that monetary policy has to affect the economy. Perhaps the more important one, and this is where another place where I think we differ, is they sent a message that they were serious about inflation, that you should not believe we're in a new permanent higher inflation thing. And most measures of long-run inflation expectations stayed pretty anchored. And to me, it's that doing, not telling, that did send a message to businesses of like, don't worry, we're not going to have inflation forever. Don't build in this huge assumption of inflation forever. And so that rapid increase meant they were in danger of losing their credibility, but they never did. And this is credibility, by the way, that they won the hard way over 30 years. And that
go to my first question, which is, you're bringing down inflation by bringing down the economy. If you have, no housing construction stopping, that's bringing down the economy as opposed to getting people to reduce inflation in a different manner through some kind of, collective coordination. What do you think of that as a alternative policy?
Yeah, so there's the cheapest, easiest, least painful way to change expectations, to change inflation, is to change expectations and do it in a self-fulfilling way. As I said, I think the Fed did that, but they did that the hard way. Your question is there some other way to do it? You do see that a little bit in other countries. In places like Japan, the central banker basically will go to the collective wage setters. In their case, he was actually trying to get them to increase inflation. So I said, raise your wages faster. And there were economists like Olivier Blanchard and Adam Posen that were strongly encouraging them to use that tool. You've seen it to some degree in Germany and the Scandinavian countries in the past as well. I'm just deeply skeptical of it, given that there are tens of millions of employers in the United States. Labor unions cover less than 10% of the workforce. There's very little centralization of any of it. And so I just don't know why anyone would care what the Fed chair told them when what they care about is what they think the other business down the street is going to do, or the workers care about what they can get from the other business. And so I don't know, maybe it's worth trying to see if we can get some new, like sunspot, self-fulfilling equilibrium here. Certainly the current way of doing it isn't great, but I'm exceedingly skeptical that you can do that unless you have something credible to back it up, or a very different institutional setup than we have in the United States.
Okay, so this brings me to, I mean, I agree with you that this is, it's a long shot, but I think it's a shot that people should try, that the Fed should try. But and Powell's a kind of a credible person, the Treasury Secretary is a credible person. There are a lot of people that could be saying the same thing at the same time that might make a difference, including the president. But here we are with mortgage rates, which I think are still around 7.25%. There's not a single house. I live in Providence. I commute to BU. There's not a single house for sale sign I see in Providence, because I think people think this is not the time to try and sell because mortgage rates are so high, and people think this is not the time to buy because mortgage rates are so high. I think that part of the mortgage rate is incorporating a risk premium here, that it's really, if you take out a 30-year mortgage, you're getting an insurance policy from the bank against surprise inflation, because if inflation takes off, well, it's not you're getting insurance. You're going to win out if inflation takes off. You get to pay back in watered down dollars. So the bank is asking for an insurance premium, and that's embedded in the mortgage rate. That part of the reason the mortgage rate is high is because the bank needs to worry about the risk of getting paid back in watered down dollars, and so they're setting the rate to cover that, and that's going to be there for a long time. I think, just like in the 80s when inflation came down after the episode in the late 70s, early 80s with high inflation, nominal rates stayed high, nominal mortgage rates stayed high, even though prices inflation was low. So the real rates were high during this period. I mean, this is a good thing for the elderly who are able to invest in long-term inflation index bonds now. I think it's 2.2% today, which is something they haven't been able to do for decades at that rate. So now is the time to lock in your retirement living standard floor by taking a good chunk of your portfolio, I think, and investing it in 30-year tips or 20, whatever, long-term tips. But I'm wondering whether we're facing kind of a, Larry Summers talked about, secular stagnation. I don't think he had any basis for that personally, based on a paper I just wrote with Alan Auerbach, but empirical basis. But now I see, this as being a long-term cost to the economy because we don't have inflation index mortgages. Maybe that's an instrument we need for somebody to introduce, maybe even at the Fed, or can help with that, or Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac could work on that problem. But then we also have these low real wages that we see. Do you see a prospect for the economy to kind of get back to 2019, or you think we're kind of stuck? And do you think that what we're seeing here is a redistribution from workers to owners of wealth, owners of assets, because the labor share has been declining, from my understanding, by several points. And how do you see things evolving through time? Are we going to we're going to have like a permanently lower level of wages than would otherwise have been the case?
So one of the really tricky things when you see a huge change like we saw in 2020 and 2021 is how much of it is a structural break versus a structural blip. And I think in the midst of these things, people tend to overestimate how much is a structural break and underestimate how much is a structural blip. I mean, just to give a different example, on September 12th, there were a lot of people that thought no one was ever going to get on an airplane again, and they'd be too afraid to. And I don't know how long it took, but not that long before we went back to flying as usual. The labor market, I think, now pretty clearly was a structural blip. There were all these articles, quiet quitting, missing workers, early retirements, etc. There was this big shift of what's called the beverage curve. So job openings went up quite a lot without the unemployment rate going down very much. And that all looked really different. But guess what? Now, if you looked at any labor aggregate, and you give it to an economist, you give them data through 2019, and you give them the 2023 data, and they were Rip Van Winkle, they weren't around, they missed the pandemic, they missed all that, they'd have no idea anything happened. It really, the labor market looks like a continuation. Now, the one thing they would notice, by the way, is real wages. Those are, as you said, lower than you would have thought, but all the aggregate quantities are roughly where you would have thought. I think the real wages will get back to where you would have thought they were, because we are right now seeing wage growth a decent amount faster than price growth. The interest rate side, I'm less sure about the structural break versus the structural blip, because there is something different about the world today than 2019, which is debt relative to the economy went up. And debt is on an upward trajectory, in part self-fulfilling because of the rise in interest rates that we've seen. And so you would expect that to put some upward pressure on interest rates. And so, I've tended to think some of the increase in interest rates was structural break, some was structural blip, and I wasn't sure how much to apportion to both categories. So the 10-year rate right now, I think it's around 4.25. I think that's probably coming down because it's temporarily high to fight inflation, because inflation expectations are high, whatever other reason, although the data doesn't show that they're high. But do I think we're going to go back to a 2.5% 10-year treasury? I certainly wouldn't count. I wouldn't count on that either. So, and I think fiscal policymakers, by the way, should be a little bit on the conservative side now, in light of probably there being a bit more upward risk to interest rates than downward risk.
Well, yeah, I guess I would say it slightly differently, that the past has been different. We've had a shock to inflation that people hadn't experienced for many years, and now they're looking for people that lend money, including the government, is looking for an inflation premium, a risk premium, because they don't want to get paid back in watered down dollars again. Like, or let me put it, no, the people buying treasuries don't want to get paid back in watered down dollars, because they've already experienced big losses in the bond market in recent years. And that's true for corporate as well as treasury bonds. How do you see fiscal policy in general in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, the country? If you look at the trustees report of Social Security for March 31st of this year, it says there's a $65.9 trillion unfunded long-term liability here for Social Security, which is more than 2 times the official debt and about 2 times GDP. Is the country bankrupt? Let me put it that way. And are people in Washington aware of it? I keep hearing people talking about the 75-year unfunded liability for Social Security, and then coming up with proposals which are going to do nothing to even that number, which is only 40% of the true horizon liability. And of course, how you label things will determine the mix between these two numbers. So it's only the infinite horizon number that's independent of labeling. So Nikki Haley is talking about raising retirement ages. I think in present value that does nothing. But tell me how you see our fiscal condition, our long run sustainability. Are you as worried as I am? And what would you do if you could be like Trump, dictator for a day? You're elected president, you get day one, you're a dictator. What would you do to fiscal policy? I know you wouldn't shoot any Republicans, but what do you do?
Yep, great. So, first of all, I think most of Social Security's problems are because you're helping people get larger benefits. If you just stop doing that, it would be fine. No, seriously, that's good work, and people are entitled to benefits that they get under the law. I'd like tax rates to be higher, but until they are, I'm going to pay my taxes at the current set of rates. So first of all, Social Security, I would never compare the debt or Social Security to 1 year's GDP. We don't need to solve this problem in 1 year. We can solve this problem and spread it out over time. And the present value of GDP is I think some number like 5 quadrillion. I haven't looked it up lately, but it's definitely begins with a Q if you're measuring it. If you measure Social Security actuarial imbalance, how much you would have to raise taxes or cut spending, that's about 1.5% of GDP. That is something that is well within manageable economically. How exactly we're going to get there politically, I'm less certain about. That's about half of the overall fiscal gap. There's lots of different ways to measure it, lots of different assumptions. I've spent some time on it lately, and I get numbers anywhere from 1% of GDP to 6% of GDP. So that's the amount you would need to immediately raise taxes or cut spending.
Let me just interject that my fiscal gap calculation, which is on my website, kotlikov.net, which is basically a unfunded liability for the entire fiscal enterprise, looking at all the outlays as projected by the CBO, and I extend the projection out into the infinite future, but we're discounting at the average return to real wealth in the US economy in the post-war, which is around 6.5% real. So I'm not discounting a low rate. And then I'm discounting, and I'm subtracting off the present available projected receipts. That's the fiscal gap. You divide that by the present value of GDP, also projected but discounted this high rate. You're short 8% of GDP every year, which is about almost like a 45% increase in every revenue stream we've got if you don't cut any spend into the future. Now I agree that so 8% of GDP could be fixed just by going to the Swedish healthcare system, because we're spending so much of GDP, 18%, and getting 21st ranked results, whereas the Swedes are spending 11%. They're fourth best in the international ranking of healthcare results. So I think there are ways to fix this, but I think it has to go probably through the healthcare system reforms. And that brings me.
Well, why don't I take we didn't give me a chance to say what I do. So I was saying 3.5 is the average of my two. We can use your 8. Either one is solvable. So in that sense, the United States is not bankrupt. We have within our GDP more than enough money if we wanted to do this entirely on the tax side. We have within our government spending more than enough excess spending that we could cut it and do it on that side. If I was right about the number, I would frankly raise spending by 4% of GDP on net and raise taxes by 7.5% of GDP on net. And I'd do that through a VAT or an X tax or something like that, which would be an efficient way to do it. As part of that increasing spending, I'd cut back on a bunch of other spending. I recognize that the thing I just described isn't wholly in the cards. So if we had to do some combination of spending cuts and tax increases, that would be fine with me too. If it was 8%, I think we'd be hard pressed to solve that more than 100% on the tax side. But and everything I said does not preclude doing serious health reform and the like. I just would like to see even more on infrastructure, even more on research, even more on preschool. I'd like to see a paid leave program. I'd like to see more money for poor children. So there's a lot of things I want, and then I'd cut back other places. I think there's money to be saved in Medicare, for example, money to be saved in Social Security. But on net, if it's up to me, I'd raise government spending, not cut it.
So, well, I'm with you on those priorities about spending. I think, 100%. I would like to spend more. I'd like to, for me, for the day, I would just go to this alternative healthcare plan, which would be basically a version of Medicare Part C for everybody in the country. And if you're in an employer plan, they could, like BU's plan, they could maintain it, but they'd have to let other people from outside of BU join it, and we have real competition. This is not that dissimilar from the Swedish or European plans, or even the Israeli or Japanese plans. But on the tax side, I need to kind of point out that marginal taxes for people at all, for the poor, I think we're locking people into poverty through having all these different programs where nobody puts together all the marginal taxation. So you have probably 30% of the poor, well, not probably, there's a paper about marginal taxation on my website that actually calculates this precisely. For every take into account 500 different state and federal programs. You have like 51 different Medicaid programs, 51 different housing programs, blah, blah, blah. So we're locking the poor into poverty because we're faced in confronting them with such high marginal taxes. The highest one we calculated was 20,000%. That's because if you earn an extra $1,000 and you save some of it, you lose some of these benefits like Medicaid, not just this year, but next year through the asset test. And then even for the higher income people, if you look at the top 1%, they're already in like a median marginal tax bracket of 45% as an average, a median across all the states. So if you have another, let's say 10% VAT, we're now they're at 65%. At what point, to me, we need to look at this whole fiscal system and fundamentally fix it so we don't lock people out of the workforce. And I think we could get more revenue for the same, by rationalizing the current system, and then we'd have more money to spend on the same programs that you and I both, would like.
Yeah, look, we in the United States have chosen to have a tax system that's quite progressive, that gets a lot of money from people at the top, and that's because both parties agree on keeping taxes the same or cutting them for the bottom 99%, and then it just toggles up or down for the top 1%. And then because of that, we end up not collecting a lot of revenue, and so we have to aggressively phase out all of our benefits. I think all of these rates would work better, progressivity would work better, et cetera, if we had more broad-based taxation like a VAT, and programs that didn't phase out in all the different kooky ways that must have taken you months or years to model. And I've used the numbers from that model, and I'm grateful that you've done it. And so, there's a much more, the more progressive system is actually to be less progressive about taxes and to not be phasing out the benefits. So I wish we could go to something like that, but the system is what it is, and I think it's worth continuing to point out. I do think if you look at incentives and the way people respond to incentives and the like, we do have a system that compared to 20 or 30 years ago gives you a lot of money for working relative to not working. And you've seen a big increase in labor supply by, for example, single mothers, who are some of the ones that have had the biggest change. So some parts of the system have become more work-oriented. Some of the phase-outs have diminished, but new ones have been introduced as well. So on balance, I think we're sort of inching in the right direction, but unless we fundamentally change our approach to taxation and spending, we can't get close to the right level.
Okay, so when are you going to, let me ask last question. When president, because I did it, it's time for you. Take your turn.
I'm not sure who would vote for me. You at least eventually got your mother to vote for you, but and I like saying what I think. And it's hard to say what you think and become president. And there's lots and lots of other reasons why it would be hard too. So,
well, listen, thank you a million for joining us. We learned a whole lot. I learned a lot, and it's great to see you again. And we are now very good friends.
Okay, excellent. I am happy to say that.